When dusk came to the valleys of Shu, the mists always seemed to linger just a little longer than in other places. They clung to the trees, drifting like forgotten prayers along the ridges, curling around the narrow roads that wound from the capital of Chengdu into the dark folds of the Qinling Mountains. If you listened carefully, you might almost imagine you could hear the sighs of those who had walked these trails before, soldiers who had never returned, officials burdened with impossible duties, peasants whose backs bent beneath the weight of sacks of millet bound for the endless campaigns. It was in this hush of a fading empire that Zhuge Liang, the man later called the Sleeping Dragon, lived out his last years. He had once been the symbol of renewal and the last brilliant chance of a fractured realm. Now he was simply an aging statesman, his slender hands stained with ink, his nights spent drafting memorials that tried to hold a nation together by sheer force of will. To understand why his final plan, his last northern expedition, was never meant to succeed, one must first understand the world that had formed around him like an encroaching tide. After Liu Bei's death in 223, Shu Han was a country much diminished. Its founding emperor had died broken-hearted in Baidicheng, unable to avenge his sworn brother Guan Yu or to overcome the humiliation dealt by Sun Quan's betrayal. The shock of the defeat at Yiling lingered long after the ashes of the burned camps had cooled. In a realm built more on the memory of Han legitimacy than on practical resources, that catastrophe struck a wound that never fully healed. Liu Shan, the son who ascended the throne, was in many ways a gentle figure, pliable, unassuming, easily swayed by both flattery and fear. He was nothing like his fierce father, whose voice could still echo in the memory of older generals as a thunderclap of ambition. The new emperor's passivity left a vacuum at the heart of the court. Into that vacuum stepped Zhuge Liang, formally appointed chancellor, and later declared the sole regent of the state. It is a curious thing to be both a genius revered in every corner of the land and a man shackled by the limitations of your own time. Even in his prime, Zhuge Liang understood that Shu Han was a house built on sand. The fertile basin around Chengdu produced much grain, but the population was small compared to the sprawling northern plains under Cao Wei. The mountains that protected Shu from invasion were also a prison of sorts, making any large-scale campaign logistically nightmarish. Roads could be blocked by a single landslide, bridges washed away by a summer storm. And yet, with each passing year, the expectation of his brilliance only grew heavier. The people believed he would find a way. The courtiers believed he alone could hold the kingdom together. Liu Shan depended on him so entirely that even small matters of state often landed on the chancellor's desk. And so Zhuge Liang labored season after season to fill the granaries, to train the armies, to keep the dream alive that one day the Han would be restored and the lost territories reclaimed. He did not allow himself the luxury of complaint, but in his private writings, preserved in fragments over centuries, there are hints of weariness so profound that it bordered on despair. One letter written to a confidant in the capital ends with a line so gentle it almost disappears into the page. If heaven grants me a few more years, perhaps I might bring some measure of peace. But if not, I have done all I can. That sentence is neither boast nor resignation. It is simply the truth of a man who saw the limits of both his brilliance and the country he served. When we think of the later years of Shu Han, It is tempting to imagine a realm perpetually aflame with battle. But the reality was often more mundane, almost quiet in its own melancholy. Each spring, reports arrived in Chengdu from outlying provinces, bad harvests, border raids, families fleeing famine. The treasury, never vast, strained to fund the military. Skilled ministers died and were replaced by men of lesser caliber. Alliances frayed. In this atmosphere of slow decline, Zhuge Liang became the last true pillar of the state. His presence was the final argument that Shu still mattered, that the dynasty had not yet accepted its fate. He was not alone in believing this. Among the common folk stories of Zhuge Liang's cleverness were told in the evenings when families gathered around oil lamps. They said that he could read the stars and foretell the winds, that he had built wooden oxen and flowing horse carts, strange contraptions that could carry grain over the steepest passes, that he never wasted a single copper coin. Some even claimed he had inherited the mantle of the Yellow Emperor's wisdom, that he possessed secrets no one else could fathom. In truth, he was a man of extraordinary discipline, but not a sorcerer. His administrative reforms did improve Shu's efficiency for a time. He enacted strict rationing, cut corruption wherever he found it, and devised intricate supply lines that astonished even his rivals in Wei. Yet no policy, no matter how ingenious, could conjure soldiers from thin air or make the mountains yield their harvests faster. By the year 227, when he prepared the first of his 5 northern expeditions, Zhuge Liang was already aware that each campaign would drain the state further. Still, he could not stop. The legitimacy of Shu rested on the claim to be the true Han, and that claim meant reclaiming the central plain. It meant striking north, even if victory was improbable. This was not only a military necessity, it was political theater, a performance to reassure the court and the people that the dream had not died. To do nothing was unthinkable. To remain behind the mountain passes would concede that Shu was little more than a footnote to history. And so, each spring, the armies gathered. Each spring, the chancellor donned his plain robe and climbed into the carriage that would carry him out of the relative comfort of Chengdu into the cold wind of the frontier. Behind him, the capital receded into the mist, an echo of a vanished Han. Those who watched him depart must have wondered what thoughts flickered behind that calm expression. Did he believe he would triumph at last? Or did he know with the quiet clarity that comes only to those who have outlived their illusions that the campaigns were never destined to succeed? These questions have no certain answer. What we know is that Zhuge Liang poured every measure of himself into the struggle. His letters, the Chu Shi Biao, have survived as a testament to that resolve. In them he lays bare the precarious state of the kingdom and pleads with Liu Shan to attend to wise counsel rather than flattery. He writes not with the thunder of a conqueror, but with the subdued voice of a caretaker trying to keep a candle lit in a storm. He knew better than anyone that Shu could not endure endless campaigns. He knew that the soldiers he called to the banners year after year were often the same exhausted men who returned home with fewer companions each time, and he knew that in the eyes of history, failure is judged more harshly than in the hearts of those who must bear it. In this knowledge lay the quiet tragedy of his later life. Zhuge Liang did not fail because he lacked vision or will. He failed because the world he inherited was already unraveling. No amount of brilliance could repair what time and fortune had worn away. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the valley roads of Shu in the early dawn. Picture the long columns of soldiers threading their way north through the mountain passes, their armor muffled in mist. Picture the chancellor in his carriage, eyes fixed ahead. He does not look back. He does not allow himself the indulgence of regret. Somewhere in his heart, perhaps, he carried the smallest, most fragile hope that this time, just this one last time, he might find a way. But even he must have sensed that the final plan was never meant to succeed. When a people lose faith in their future, the past can become a kind of shelter. For the state of Shu Han, that past was the glory of the Han dynasty, a memory so bright that its afterimage lingered even when the reality had faded into dust. And in the years after Liu Bei's death, there was no figure who embodied that longing more completely than Zhuge Liang. He had pledged himself to Liu Bei not merely as a servant, but as the steward of a cause. When he joined Liu Bei's camp in the early years of chaos, he had been a young man of such reputation that even rival warlords respected his counsel. But the Shu that Liu Bei founded was always a precarious enterprise. Its legitimacy depended less on force than on the belief that it carried the mandate of the Han. And so, when Liu Bei died, that belief passed to Zhuge Liang like an heirloom too precious to discard. It was said that in his private study, he kept a painted scroll of the Han imperial dragon. The ink had faded over the decades and the silk was frayed at the edges, but he would sometimes sit before it in the small hours of the night, contemplating the symbol of the dynasty he had vowed to restore. Perhaps in those moments he allowed himself to feel the distance between aspiration and reality. To understand why he continued to launch northern expeditions, knowing how frail his position was, one must see the North as he saw it, not merely as territory, but as the stage upon which the final act of the Han would be written. The land north of Shu was the cradle of imperial power. Luoyang and Chang'an had been the twin capitals of a unified China for centuries, the seat of emperors and the source of laws that bound all people under heaven. In the plains of the Wei River Valley, in the walled cities of Guangzhong, lay the heart of what the Han had been. For Zhuge Liang, no peace could be real while that heart beat in the chest of Cao Wei. And so year after year he returned to the same plan, assemble the army, prepare the supply trains, and strike north along the same ancient roads that had borne generations of soldiers before them. There was in this repetition a quality both noble and tragic. Each campaign began in hope and ended in retreat. Each failure eroded not only the strength of Shu, but the patience of the court and the stamina of the common people. Yet each new spring, he persuaded himself and everyone around him that this time would be different. What drove this persistence? Was it ambition, duty? A fear that to stop would be to admit defeat. Perhaps it was all of these braided so tightly that they could no longer be separated. Zhuge Liang was a man of discipline beyond ordinary measure. He rose before dawn, inspected reports, with a precision that bordered on obsession, and held himself to standards no one else dared impose. He was not known for warmth. Those who served under him often remarked on his austerity, the sense that he carried in his bearing the burden of every failure and every hope. And yet those same men followed him, because they believed he embodied something rare, a loyalty that transcended advantage. The first northern expedition launched in 227 was planned with meticulous care. He wrote to Liu Shan explaining in the celebrated memorial, now called the Chu Shi Biao, that the future of Shu depended on action rather than caution. He argued that the longer they waited, the stronger Cao Wei would grow until no opportunity remained. Even then, some in the court believed it was a fool's errand. They pointed to the terrain narrow valleys where an army could be strangled. They pointed to the cost each campaign devoured a year's worth of grain, and often more. And they whispered that the Chancellor's resolve was born not of strategy, but of desperation. But Zhuge Liang's mind was clear. He understood exactly how long the odds were. He also understood that to sit behind the walls of Chengdu waiting for the end would erode the legitimacy of the dynasty far faster than any defeat in the field. There was a paradox in his logic to preserve Shu. He had to endanger it. To maintain the appearance of strength, he had to exhaust the country's strength. From the vantage of centuries, it is easy to see how the pattern was set. Each expedition followed a similar script. The soldiers were mustered, the war carts loaded, the banners raised. The army crossed into the northern passes, seized outlying positions, and waited for Wei to respond. And each time the decisive blow never came. Either logistics failed, or reinforcements could not arrive, or weather turned against them. Still, Zhuge Liang did not waver. In the second and third campaigns, he refined his tactics, trying to adapt to the challenges. He experimented with decoy movements, feints, and diversionary attacks. He negotiated with semi-independent warlords in Liangzhou, hoping to open a second front. He even contemplated building permanent forts deep in enemy territory to shorten supply lines. But the cost remained punishing. Grain ran low, men grew weary. At home, the fields went untended as more peasants were conscripted. In private, some ministers wondered whether the dream of restoration was worth the price. It is telling that in all these efforts, Zhuge Liang never sought personal power. Unlike many regents who usurped thrones, he never advanced himself beyond the role Liu Bei had entrusted to him. He signed his memorials as the humble subject, never forgetting that the authority he wielded was borrowed, not earned, by conquest. That humility, however, did not make him immune to the pressures of expectation. With each campaign that ended in withdrawal, he felt the walls closing in. A lesser man might have abandoned the cause, declared Shu too small to resist the currents of history. But to Zhuge Liang the cause was not negotiable. One must imagine how heavy those nights must have felt, the bivouacs under the cold stars, the breath of thousands of soldiers rising in unison, the knowledge that they were all tethered to a vision perhaps no longer possible. When he looked north from the ridges of the Qinling Mountains, perhaps he saw not just enemy territory, but a graveyard of dreams he could never let go. Among the commanders who rode with him, some admired him without question. Others resented the endless strain. A few believed he clung to the dream of Han legitimacy not only for duty, but because without it, he would have no purpose. And though they dared not say so openly, they sometimes wondered whether victory was truly the goal, or whether simply trying was the only thing he could offer. In the stories that would be told later, Zhuge Liang's northern expeditions would become examples of indomitable resolve. The details of failure would be softened by time, replaced with tales of cunning and unbroken spirit. In one legend, it is said that he summoned the wind itself to turn the tide of battle. In another, that he built automata wooden soldiers that marched unceasingly across the plains. But the truth was more human and therefore more poignant. He was a man who knew the odds, who understood the price, and who persisted anyway. This persistence was the heart of the dream he carried, the dream that Shu Han could, against all evidence, become more than a remnant. And so, each year as the snow melted from the passes, the army gathered again. Drums beat, horses stamped in the cold, the roads filled with carts piled high with sacks of millet and dried meat. Once more the banners of Han fluttered against the wind. Once more Zhuge Liang climbed into his carriage, his face pale with fatigue, but resolute. Some part of him must have known that the plan could never succeed as he wished, but to do less to surrender to caution would be to betray the oath he had sworn so long ago in a simpler time when he first agreed to serve Liu Bei under the mulberry trees. That oath had become his life's compass, and even as the empire he loved slipped further beyond saving, he could not turn aside. In that steadfastness lay the beginnings of both his legend and his tragedy. If you stood on the walls of Chengdu in the springtime and looked out across the patchwork fields, it was possible for a moment to believe that Shu was a prosperous land. The river glittered under the pale sky. Farmers led oxen along the dikes, children splashed in irrigation channels, and plum blossoms drifted down like confetti over the narrow roads. From a distance, it all seemed peaceful. But this vision was as fragile as a reflection in water. Beneath the surface lay the strain of a state that had never been strong enough to sustain its own ambitions. The territory of Shu Han was fertile but small. Its natural boundaries, high mountains and steep gorges, were both shield and prison. In times of peace, those barriers had protected the people from the chaos beyond. But in times of war, they became obstacles that sapped energy and will. Every northern expedition began with the same exhausting preparation. Grain had to be gathered from scattered farms, measured out in precise quotas, and transported over hundreds of aloi along roads that were sometimes little more than goat tracks clinging to cliffs. Porters carried baskets on their backs until their feet bled. Mules slipped and perished in the gorges, and always the question hung over the entire enterprise. Was any of this sustainable? Zhuge Liang knew better than anyone that it was not. He had spent years overhauling the bureaucracy to make it more efficient. He had standardized weights and measures, tightened tax collection, and punished corruption wherever it appeared. Officials feared his inspections because he was tireless, methodical, and unyielding. Yet even the most rigorous discipline could not conjure surplus resources. Shu Han simply did not have the reserves to match Wei's endless manpower or the deep coffers of the old Han heartlands. The census records carefully preserved in the archives show that the population of Shu was perhaps a quarter of what the North could muster. Every man conscripted left a gap in the fields. Every campaign season meant an autumn harvest less abundant than the last. Over the course of years, the cumulative toll became impossible to ignore. There is a quiet sorrow in reading those old accounts. They do not shout of calamity. Instead, they record it in the language of lists and numbers of the households. Registered 1 in 5 has no able-bodied laborer. In such cases, the levy is suspended, but the quota remains unfulfilled. In this district, the fields lie fallow. In the next, the yield is half of prior years. The cause fatigue conscription and insufficient seed. This was the reality behind the grand proclamations of the court. While officials debated strategy and recited stirring rhetoric about restoring Han authority, the villages emptied of young men, and old women tried to coax a harvest from exhausted soil. From the perspective of the capital, the picture was no brighter. The treasury, already strained by decades of conflict, struggled to meet basic obligations. Minting new coinage was no solution. The people quickly lost faith in currency that held no intrinsic value. Prices rose. Salt and iron grew scarce. Officials were paid late or not at all. And yet the weight of expectation never lifted. Each time Zhuge Liang returned from a campaign weary and unshaven, there were still crowds lining the roads to catch a glimpse of him. Parents held up children so they could see the man who was supposed to change their destiny. In the hush that fell as his carriage passed, you could almost hear the question, "When will you succeed?" How must that question have sounded to a man who knew the limits of his resources as intimately as he knew the lines in his own palm? To many in the court, the answer was clear. It was time to abandon grand offensives and secure what remained, to entrench, to conserve strength, to settle for survival. They argued that no matter how noble the dream of reunification was, it was no longer possible. The kingdom's first duty, they said, was to the people, not to lost ambitions. But Zhuge Liang was not persuaded. He did not reject their reasoning because he was blind to reality. He rejected it because to him, survival without purpose was a slow death. A kingdom that ceased to strive would decay from within. It would lose not only territory, but spirit. And so he persisted while privately acknowledging the cost. Among the officers who served under him, there were some who shared his conviction. Jiang Wei, in particular, became his most loyal disciple, determined to continue the campaigns after Zhuge Liang's death. But there were others like Wei Yan who grew frustrated by the chancellor's caution and endless logistics. Wei Yan had fought in the north before. He believed the only path to victory lay in bold strikes and rapid advances, not in careful preparation. To him, Zhuge Liang's meticulous approach was evidence that the chancellor lacked the nerve to gamble everything. Their disagreements grew more pointed with each passing year. This tension was not confined to the generals. In the towns and villages, families waited for word of sons and husbands conscripted to the front. The announcements posted on the walls in black ink became a source of dread. For many, a summons to serve meant never returning. At night, in the poorer quarters of Chengdu, people told stories about the campaigns, some of them hopeful, most of them grim. Children would ask their mothers when father was coming home, and the answers would trail off into silence. In this way, the burden of war seeped into every corner of Shu. The kingdom did not collapse all at once. It simply wore itself thin, season by season, as if the effort to uphold its ideals was draining the life from its soil and people. And still the campaigns continued. Why? Because Zhuge Liang believed, with a clarity that few others shared, that the alternative was worse. To wait passively behind mountain passes was to declare defeat in all but name, to accept that Shu was only a minor kingdom clinging to borrowed time. His northern expeditions were not only military ventures. They were declarations of intent, signals to the world that Shu had not relinquished the claim to the mandate of heaven. and though he never said so in public, perhaps he also understood that once he was gone, there would be no one else able to bear that claim forward. He was the last figure whose reputation was strong enough to rally men to the cause. Even his critics recognized this. They might have argued with his strategy, but few questioned his sincerity. Fewer still could have inspired the same measure of loyalty. When you look back across the centuries, it can be hard to see how desperate those last years were. History tends to smooth away the edges, to turn struggle into legend. But if you listen carefully to the fragments of letters, the complaints recorded in court archives, the decrees that postponed taxes because no one could pay them, you begin to sense how much was unraveling beneath the surface. Zhuge Liang faced this knowledge every day, and though he was not a man given to lament, it is hard to imagine he did not sometimes look out across the fields of Shu and feel the weight of it pressing against his chest. In the end, the reality was inescapable. Shu Han's resources were finite. Its people exhausted, its treasury nearly empty. Every campaign was a gamble, and the odds grew longer with each passing season. Yet he persisted because to do otherwise was to admit that the dream of Han restoration had become impossible. And for Zhuge Liang, for the man who had sworn an oath beneath the mulberry trees, some dreams could not be abandoned, even when the cost was everything. It is sometimes said that hope can be more dangerous than despair, because it keeps men striving long after reason has advised surrender. Nowhere is this truer than in the story of Zhuge Liang's repeated northern expeditions, 5 grand campaigns across the passes that guarded the threshold between Shu and the great northern plain. From a distance of centuries, these expeditions seem to blend together in memory, an endless procession of banners, ox carts, and weary soldiers tramping the same narrow roads. But each campaign had its own ambitions, its own plans, its own quiet tragedies. The first expedition began in 227. In that year, the realm of Wei seemed momentarily vulnerable. Sima Yi, the cautious but formidable general who would later become Zhuge Liang's lifelong adversary, was not yet the supreme commander. The Wei regent Cao Zhen was preoccupied with threats on other fronts, and the Wei emperor Cao Rui was still consolidating his power. To Zhuge Liang, this was the slender window he'd been waiting for. His strategy was methodical rather than daring. Instead of charging directly into the Wei heartlands, he aimed to secure a foothold in the Guanzhong region, an area whose fields could supply his armies and whose position would allow further advances. He led his forces north from Hanzhong, capturing outlying positions and pushing toward Mount Kui. It was a careful advance. Supply lines were constantly reinforced, detachments were deployed to protect foraging parties, and contingencies were planned for every conceivable setback. The meticulousness was necessary. Shu's resources could not afford improvisation. Every sack of grain, every replacement spear, every mule was accounted for. If a single convoy were lost, the entire enterprise could collapse. For a time it seemed this caution might pay off. Wei was caught off balance, and Zhuge Liang's army advanced further than many had expected. But as the summer dragged on, the momentum began to fade. The longer his forces remained in the field, the more vulnerable they became to attrition. In the end, Wei regrouped faster than anticipated. Reinforcements arrived under Cao Zhen, and the Shu army found itself at risk of encirclement. Supplies dwindled. Morale began to waver. Zhuge Liang ordered a withdrawal. He did not call it a retreat. Official proclamations emphasized that the campaign had achieved strategic objectives, weakened the enemy, and demonstrated Shu's resolve. But everyone understood that the expedition had failed to deliver the decisive blow it promised. The soldiers returned through the passes in autumn. Their banners were still held aloft, but their eyes were fixed on the road ahead, eager to be home before the mountain snows closed in. In Chengdu, crowds gathered to greet them. Parents searched the ranks for familiar faces. Some found them. Others went home in silence, clutching only the memories of those who had not returned. The second expedition came quickly on the heels of the first. In 228, Zhuge Liang again set out for Mount Qi. This time he attempted a bold stratagem, dividing his forces to draw Wei into a disadvantageous engagement. One detachment was sent to threaten Mei County, while the main force pressed against the fortified positions near Mount Qi. For a moment, success seemed close. The detachment under Zhao Yun executed its diversion perfectly, pulling Wei's attention away. Meanwhile, Zhuge Liang's main army advanced rapidly, capturing outlying garrisons. But as so often happens in war, small miscalculations proved decisive. The supply situation, already precarious, worsened when rains turned the roads to mire. The diversionary force, though courageous, lacked the strength to hold out indefinitely. When Wei forces realized the ploy, they struck back with overwhelming force. The Shu armies were forced to consolidate, abandoning their advanced positions. Again, Zhuge Liang withdrew. Some of his critics in the court began to murmur more openly. They pointed out that despite all the effort, all the expense, the campaigns returned little but exhaustion. The chancellor's reputation, once untouchable, began to show cracks. But if Zhuge Liang felt this pressure, he did not allow it to alter his conviction. In 229, the third expedition commenced. By now, the campaigns had settled into a grim rhythm. Spring brought preparations, grain stockpiled, conscripts, assembled war carts repaired. Summer saw the long columns moving north, the familiar pattern of cautious advance. Autumn heralded the decision advance, or withdraw, and more often than not, it ended in retreat. In this third attempt, Zhuge Liang tried to cultivate alliances with tribes beyond Wei's direct control. He negotiated with local chieftains and sought to foment rebellion among Wei's frontier garrisons. For a time, these efforts bore fruit. Skirmishes went in Shu's favor. Several Wei outposts surrendered, preferring the promise of leniency to the certainty of siege. But the deeper Zhuge Liang's forces penetrated, the more strained his supply lines became. Each mile of advance multiplied the danger that a single lost convoy would doom the campaign. And so, as autumn rains approached, he judged that he could not hold his positions through winter. Once more he ordered a withdrawal. One can imagine the quiet that must have settled over the soldiers as they retraced their steps. The same mountains, the same treacherous passes, the same weary thoughts. Some of them must have wondered whether they would ever march north again, or whether in the end Shu's destiny was to retreat forever. Yet Zhuge Liang was not finished. In 231, he prepared the fourth expedition. This time his opponent was Sima Yi, a commander whose caution and patience rivaled his own. Sima Yi understood that Zhuge Liang's campaigns were a test of endurance as much as force. He refused to be baited into risky engagements. Instead, he fortified strong positions and waited for Shu's logistics to unravel. Zhuge Liang in turn tried to provoke Sima Yi into action. He deployed skirmishers to harass supply lines, sent false reports to suggest weakness, and maneuvered to threaten critical roads. But Sima Yi remained immovable, content to let time wear down his adversary. In this war of attrition, the advantage always lay with Wei. Their reserves were deeper, their manpower greater. No matter how efficiently Zhuge Liang managed Shu's resources, he could not change that fundamental imbalance. By summer's end, supplies once again dwindled. His men were exhausted. The rain clouds gathered over the mountains. For the fourth time, he withdrew. The campaigns had achieved some tactical gains, forts taken, enemy resources consumed, but never the decisive victory he needed. And still the people waited. In Chengdu, every spring became a season of hope and dread. Hope that this time would be different. Dread that it would be the same. When the fifth expedition was announced, some questioned whether it was wise to continue. Ministers argued that Shu could not bear another campaign. Families pleaded for their sons to be spared conscription. But Zhuge Liang would not abandon the effort. In his view, to stop was to concede that Shu Han's claim to legitimacy was nothing more than empty ceremony. However slender the hope, it had to be pursued. And so, as he prepared his final northern expedition, the soldiers gathered once more. The road north was unchanged, but everything else had grown more fragile: the treasury, the will of the people, the strength of the army, and perhaps even Zhuge Liang himself. In the gathering dusk of his life, he resolved to make this last attempt, knowing that if he failed, there might be no more chances. And though he never spoke the words aloud, perhaps he sensed that the final plan he would devise was not truly meant to succeed, but simply to prove that Shu had not yet surrendered to inevitability. It is an easy thing, looking back across centuries, to imagine that failure must have come from some obvious flaw, a tactical blunder, a moment of cowardice, an unwise alliance. But the truth is rarely so simple. The final northern expedition of Zhuge Liang, the last in a long sequence of campaigns, was not undone by a single misstep. It was undone by the slow accumulation of limitations, too vast for any one man, no matter how gifted, to overcome. The first of these was the fundamental weakness of Shu's economy. Even after years of administrative reform, the kingdom remained a land of modest means. The fertile Chengdu plain could produce enough grain to feed the people in years of peace. But war demanded far more food for soldiers and animals, iron for weapons, timber for carts, and fortifications, and countless other supplies. Every campaign exhausted reserves that could never be fully replenished. Zhuge Liang understood this intimately. He had designed intricate rationing systems, instructed local officials to collect surpluses, and personally oversaw the construction of granaries. It is said he once walked for hours through a warehouse in Hanzhong, checking the sacks of millet himself, running handfuls of grain through his fingers to judge their quality. But even such care could not change the fact that each expedition left Shu weaker than before. By the time of the final campaign, the treasury was nearly empty. The fields had been depleted by repeated levies. The burden of taxation fell ever more heavily on the peasants, who remained, many of them elderly or infirm, because the young and strong had been sent to the front. This was the first and greatest reason why success was slipping beyond reach. Shu had simply run out of resources to sustain an indefinite struggle. The second cause lay in the geography itself. The Qinling Mountains, which formed a natural barrier between the north and the Shu Basin, were both fortress and prison. To move an army through them required weeks of preparation. The roads, if they could be called roads, were narrow tracks where a single landslide could sever supply lines. Bridges built in the spring might wash away in the first summer storm. Every campaign was a race against time and terrain. If the advance stalled, if rains came early, if the harvest in Guangzhong failed to materialize, the expedition could not survive the winter. This dependence on fragile logistics made any sustained offensive almost impossible. Sima Yi understood this perfectly. That is why he so often refused to engage in open battle. He knew that if he simply waited, the mountains and the weather would do his work for him. And indeed, they did. The third cause of inevitable failure was the state of the army itself. Though Zhuge Liang commanded soldiers of great courage and discipline, they were drawn from a population too small to replace losses indefinitely. Every campaign eroded not only numbers, but morale. In the early expeditions, there was still a sense of optimism, the belief that success was within reach, if only they pushed a little further. But by the final campaign, that faith had faded. Men marched because it was their duty, not because they expected victory. Officers carried out orders with grim determination rather than conviction. The hush that settled over the camps at night was not the quiet of anticipation, but the resignation of men who knew how the story would end. In this climate, even the smallest setback could magnify into a crisis. The fourth cause lay in politics. At home in Chengdu, support for endless campaigning was fraying. Though the court outwardly deferred to Zhuge Liang, private letters and records show that many ministers believed the campaigns were bleeding Shu to death. They argued, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in formal petitions, that it was time to abandon the dream of reconquest and fortify what remained. Some suggested negotiating a permanent truce with Wei, even if it meant accepting a lesser status. But for Zhuge Liang, this was unthinkable. To surrender the claim to the Han Mandate would be to declare that Shu was no longer the rightful heir to legitimacy. And legitimacy was the only thing that had kept the kingdom alive through years of adversity. Yet the chancellor could not be blind to the truth. His authority, though still immense, was not absolute. If he failed again, the murmurs in the court would grow louder. The foundation on which he had built his campaign's unity of purpose was crumbling beneath his feet. The fifth cause was more personal, and perhaps the most decisive of all. Zhuge Liang was dying. Though he concealed it as best he could, his health had been failing for years. The endless labor drafting plans late into the night, inspecting troops at dawn, riding long miles through wind and rain had taken a toll. His body, once slender and strong, had grown gaunt. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. By the time he led the final expedition to Wujiang Plains, he was no longer the vigorous strategist who had first served Liu Bei. He was a man sustained only by will. There is something almost unbearably human in imagining him standing in the twilight of the camp, looking north across the broad plain that he would never cross. He knew he must have known that his life was measured in days or weeks, and still he pressed on. It is tempting to see this as folly, a man who could not let go of an impossible dream. But there is another way to see it, too, as a final act of fidelity to everything he believed in. If he must die, he would do so facing north, still trying to reclaim what had been lost. This convergence of factors, economic weakness, unforgiving terrain, an exhausted army political division, and his own failing health, made success all but unattainable. And yet Zhuge Liang never admitted this publicly. He continued to issue orders to devise strategies to project an air of unshaken purpose. He understood that if he wavered, everyone else would waver too. So he became, in the last months of his life, a living embodiment of resolve and idea, as much as a man. Some historians have asked whether he knew that the final plan was never meant to succeed, whether he understood that it was less a strategy of victory than an affirmation of Shu's spirit in the face of encroaching darkness. We will never know, but perhaps when the wind blew across the tents at Wuzhang Plains, carrying the smell of rain and distant wood smoke, Zhuge Liang allowed himself a moment of private honesty. Perhaps in that moment he understood that this was not the prelude to triumph, but a farewell. And in the hush that followed, he did not regret it. For a man who had given everything to a single cause, there was no other way the story could end. Among all the challenges that beset Zhuge Liang's final expedition, none was more persistent, more quietly ruinous than the problem of supply. Armies, no matter how valiant, march on their stomachs. And in the mountain-bound state of Shu, every campaign began with the same question: could enough grain be moved across the high passes to feed tens of thousands of men? The answer was always uncertain, and in the end, it was this uncertainty that made victory impossible. From the first days of preparation, the effort to gather and transport provisions consumed more energy than any other task. Zhuge Liang himself often supervised the process. While some generals delegated logistics to subordinates, he treated it as the heart of strategy. He knew that any battle could be won or lost before the first spear was lifted simply by the failure of a single convoy. In the valleys of Shu, peasants harvested millet, barley, and rice under the watchful eyes of officials appointed by the chancellor. Every measure of grain was recorded sealed and assigned to a specific depot. These storehouses dotted the landscape from Chengdu to Hanzhong, rows of thatched roofs, each one stacked high with sacks carefully labeled for the northern front. Even as the war carts creaked under their loads, there was never a sense of abundance. At best, there was just enough, provided the weather cooperated, provided the roads remained passable, provided no bandits or enemy raiders struck the convoys. The first leg of the journey was through territory relatively safe from Wei incursions. Here the danger came less from the enemy than from nature itself. Rains turned roads to sludge. Mules stumbled on rocky inclines. Porters slipped from narrow paths and vanished into ravines so deep that recovering the cargo was impossible. It was because of these risks that Zhuge Liang had devised the famous wooden oxen and flowing horse carts. These ingenious vehicles, part sled, part wheelbarrow, could be pushed by a small team over rough ground where wagons could not pass. They were slower than a train of mules, but far more reliable on treacherous slopes. When the first wooden oxen rolled into the supply lines, soldiers gathered to stare. Some whispered that they were proof the chancellor possessed a supernatural wisdom. Others, more practically minded, saw only the latest contrivance in a war that had already devoured so much effort. But even the most clever devices could not change the unyielding arithmetic of distance and demand. It took dozens of men to move enough food for a single day of rations for a single battalion. Multiply this by weeks of marching and thousands of soldiers, and the challenge grew beyond imagining. And then there was spoilage. Grain stored in damp weather sprouted mildew, dried meat decayed in the heat of late summer. Jars of oil and vinegar cracked under sudden cold. Every campaign began with a calculation of how much would be lost to these silent enemies, and even the most careful plans often underestimated the toll. So much of war is invisible to those who only read the chronicles. Battles fill the records with names and dates, victories and defeats. But rarely do the historians linger over the unglamorous business of keeping an army fed. Yet for Zhuge Liang, this was where the real struggle unfolded. He spent hours each day poring over ledgers and reports from the quartermasters. He orders scouts to survey the roads ahead, to record the depth of streams, the condition of bridges, the locations of way stations where mules could be rested and refitted. When shortages loomed, as they inevitably did, he rationed supplies with a severity that caused resentment among the ranks. Soldiers grumbled that while the chancellor was revered for his fairness, he was also pitiless. He would not permit even a single grain to be wasted, no matter how tired or hungry the men became. In some accounts, it is said that he inspected the cauldrons himself, measuring the porridge with a wooden rod to ensure that no cook was taking more than his share. Whether this story is fact or legend, it captures something true about the spirit of those campaigns. Nothing was left to chance, and nothing was spared. During the final expedition to Wujiang Plains, the problem of supply reached its most desperate pitch. The main supply line stretched back hundreds of li to the depots in Hanzhong. Each convoy took weeks to make the round trip. The autumn rains came early that year, washing out stretches of road and turning others into bogs so deep that mules had to be euthanized when they sank too far to be pulled free. As the days grew shorter, the soldiers watched the horizon for the plumes of dust that would signal a new caravan arriving. Each time a column finally appeared, they cheered, not because they believed victory was close, but because it meant they would eat for a few more days. Meanwhile, Sima Yi waited. He understood, as Zhuge Liang did, that if he could prolong the stalemate, hunger would fight the battle for him. Rather than risking a costly engagement, he fortified his positions and dispatched small bands of cavalry to harass the Shu supply lines. Some of these raids were spectacular successes. One convoy carrying thousands of measures of grain was surprised at dawn. The guards scattered the wagons were torched, and the survivors straggled back with nothing but apologies. Even when the losses were smaller, the effect was cumulative. Each shipment destroyed or delayed became a day closer to exhaustion. In the evenings, as the drizzle settled over the plains and the campfires smoked in the wind, Zhuge Liang must have looked over his ledgers and known that time was running out. He had tried every means he could devise to sustain the army. He had written to the court in Chengdu to plead for more resources, knowing there were none to send. He'd reduced the daily rations, a decision that earned him silent curses from men too proud to complain aloud. He had even ordered the construction of makeshift granaries near the front, an effort to stockpile enough food that if the weather turned, they would have a buffer. But each storehouse could only hold so much, and every week of stalemate emptied them faster than they could be refilled. In the end, the story of the final northern expedition is not merely the story of strategic maneuvers and duels of wits. It is the story of countless nameless laborers trudging through rain and cold, the weight of 100 weight of millet on their backs, the knowledge that every step was a step deeper into a campaign that might never return them home. It is the story of cooks boiling thin gruel of scribes, scratching inventory tallies by lantern light of quartermasters, standing in muddy fields as wagons sank to their axles. It is the story of a chancellor who believed that discipline and ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, and who learned in the last months of his life that some obstacles are not meant to be overcome. When you imagine those nights at Wujiang Plains, do not picture only the generals in their tents poring over maps. Picture also the long trains of wooden oxen creaking through the dark. Picture the flicker of torches reflected in the pools of rainwater on the roads. Picture the men too tired to lift their heads when the order came to march again. They were the lifeblood of the dream, and when the grain was gone, so too was the last chance of victory. In times of crisis, unity is both the most precious resource and the easiest to squander. Zhuge Liang knew this better than anyone. He had seen what ambition and suspicion could do to a kingdom, how a single fracture in trust could widen into a rift that swallowed everything. Perhaps that is why he fought so hard to hold the court together, even as resources dwindled and the odds of victory grew ever more remote. Yet for all his skill, for all the awe he inspired, Zhuge Liang could not fully silence the voices of doubt that rose in the long years of struggle. The seeds of internal discord had been sown early. When Liu Bei died and left his young son on the throne, the kingdom became a house divided between those who had built it and those who inherited it. The old guard men like Wei Yan had earned their reputations through the chaos of conquest. They were warriors, first, administrators, second, and their loyalty had been to Liu Bei himself. By contrast, the younger generation of officials owed their positions to Zhuge Liang's patronage and shared his cautious temperament. They believed discipline and planning were the only bulwarks against annihilation. To them, recklessness was a luxury Shu could not afford. Over time, these differences in temperament became differences in ideology. Wei Yan in particular grew restless under the chancellor's command. He was a brilliant tactician in his own right, known for his daring raids and an instinct for seizing the initiative. Where Zhuge Liang favored methodical preparation, Wei Yan believed speed and audacity were the keys to victory. Again and again he argued for bolder strategies. He proposed striking deep into Guangzhong, with a flying column bypassing the heavily defended passes, and forcing Sima Yi into open battle before Wei's reserves could mobilize. To Wei Yan, caution was not prudence, but paralysis. He saw in Zhuge Liang's reluctance to risk everything a fear that doomed Shu to slow exhaustion. But to Zhuge Liang, Wei Yan's proposals were reckless fantasies. He understood that a failed gamble would not merely lose a battle, it would end the entire cause. There were no reserves to replace a broken army, no treasure to raise new legions. If he committed to an all-or-nothing offensive and failed, Shu would be left defenseless before the wrath of Wei. Their disagreements were never truly resolved. Though Wei Yan continued to serve under the chancellor's banner, his frustration became an open secret among the officers. Some admired his spirit. Others resented his insolence. All of them felt the tension in the air whenever his name was mentioned in the council tent. These divisions were not confined to the military. In Chengdu, the court itself was splitting into factions. One group, composed largely of civil officials, believed that Zhuge Liang's campaigns were unsustainable. They argued that Shu should abandon offensive operations, fortify its mountain passes, and negotiate a truce that would preserve the kingdom's autonomy, even if it meant recognizing Wei's supremacy in the north. They whispered that the chancellor's pride had become indistinguishable from stubbornness. Another faction, led by men who had risen under Zhuge Liang's reforms, insisted that the northern expeditions were the only means of maintaining legitimacy. They accused the peace faction of cowardice and defeatism. Each memorial sent to the throne carried a hidden undercurrent, praise for the chancellor veiled with polite criticism or calls for prudence couched in deferential language. Liu Shan, the young emperor, lacked the strength to arbitrate between them. Though he respected Zhuge Liang deeply, he also feared the burden that endless war placed on the people. He listened to all sides and committed to none, a pattern that would persist long after the chancellor was gone. In this climate, even small incidents could take on disproportionate importance. When a supply convoy was lost to a raid, rumors spread that it had been deliberately sabotaged by those who wished to discredit the war effort. When soldiers deserted, their motives were dissected in whispered speculation. Were they merely tired, or had someone encouraged them to abandon the cause? Zhuge Liang labored to keep these suspicions from erupting into open conflict. He issued proclamations praising the courage of his officers and the patience of the people. He forbade public accusations of treachery without evidence. He reminded the court again and again that division was the surest path to ruin. But he must have known that unity built on exhaustion and fear was brittle. Among his closest confidants, only Jiang Wei shared his unwavering faith in the northern expeditions. The young general had studied under Zhuge Liang and absorbed both his discipline and his conviction. He became in the final years the chancellor's staunchest advocate and eventual heir to the strategy of perpetual resistance. Yet even Jiang Wei could not soothe the misgivings of those who had lost faith. The common people, too, felt the strain. In the marketplaces of Chengdu, merchants grumbled that conscription had robbed them of laborers. In the villages along the roads, North families prayed each spring that their sons would be overlooked by the levy. Some still believed in the dream. They spoke of Zhuge Liang as the last pillar of Han virtue. They took pride in his reputation as the one man who could stand against Wei's might. Others quietly began to wonder whether the price was too high. In the evenings, as the oil lamps flickered in the wind, neighbors shared stories of old campaigns and measured how much hope they still had left. In the camps along the Wujiang plains, the soldiers felt these doubts more acutely than anyone. When orders came to ration supplies again, when the rain turned the tents to sodden heaps, when the horizon offered no sign that this year would be different from all the others, they turned inward. Some clung to discipline because it was the only certainty left. Others began to whisper in the darkness that perhaps Wei Yan was right, that a single desperate stroke would be better than this slow wasting away. And somewhere in the deep hours of the night, Zhuge Liang must have sat alone with these thoughts. He'd given everything to hold Shu together, his intellect, his health, his spirit, and yet he could not will perfect unity into existence. Even he could not banish doubt from men's hearts. Perhaps that was the hardest lesson of all, that in the end no amount of discipline could make other men see the world exactly as he did. The dream of restoring the Han was his alone to carry, and with every passing season it grew heavier, and yet he would carry it still because he could not imagine any other path. When the spring of 234 came to the Shu kingdom, it arrived with a softness that almost seemed to mock the harshness of the times. Plum blossoms opened along the riverbanks near Chengdu. The fields turned green again, and for a moment it was possible to believe that the land itself was indifferent to the ambitions of men. But in the corridors of the palace, the atmosphere was anything but tranquil. The court was filled with the sound of low arguments and the scratch of brushes on memorials. Each official had an opinion about the chancellor's new expedition, and none dared speak too plainly for fear of seeming disloyal or, worse, unpatriotic. Zhuge Liang's decision to launch his fifth and final northern expedition was not made lightly. He knew the treasury was all but exhausted. He knew the army's strength was dwindling. He knew that every campaign without decisive victory made the next one harder to justify, and yet when the question was laid before him, would he attempt it again, his answer was the same as it had always been. Yes, this time he chose the Wujiang Plains as the battleground. It was a region of wide grassy fields bordered by low hills, with the Wei River meandering nearby. Strategically, it offered several advantages: easier supply routes than the deeper heartlands, enough space for maneuvering large forces and defensible positions should the enemy attempt to encircle his army. But perhaps more than any tactical consideration, Wujiang represented the last threshold between persistence and surrender. To Zhuge Liang, this was the place where he would prove, if only to himself, that Shu's claim to legitimacy still burned. In the weeks before the march, he prepared with his familiar relentless thoroughness. He instructed the quartermasters to gather every remaining store of grain. He ordered new wooden oxen to be constructed and trained fresh teams of porters in their use. He reviewed maps, studied the weather reports, and sent scouts ahead to survey roads and river crossings. When it was time to depart, the army assembled with the somber discipline of men who had walked this road many times before. There was no cheering this time, no rush of eager optimism. Instead, there was a hush that hung over the columns like a final blessing or a final warning. Some soldiers wept as they embraced their families, and it was not the bright grief of first parting, but the quieter sorrow of knowing that this would be the last. Zhuge Liang rode in a plain carriage at the center of the procession. Witnesses would later say that he seemed smaller than they remembered, thinner, more fragile, his face drawn and pale. Yet when he raised his hand to acknowledge the crowds lining the roads, the gesture was steady. He was already sick when he set out. Though he did not disclose the true severity of his condition, those closest to him could see it in the way he paused to catch his breath after speaking, the way he gripped the carriage rail when he rose. But he would not delay. To postpone the expedition was to concede that it might never happen at all, and that was a concession he could not make. Once the army reached the Wujiang Plains, the camps were laid out in precise order. Granaries were constructed from prefabricated timbers, hauled all the way from Hanzhong. Defensive earthworks rose in methodical lines, and observation towers were raised to watch for Sima Yi's movements. The chancellor's tent stood at the heart of the encampment. There he worked long into the nights, dictating orders and receiving reports. He knew Sima Yi would not be easily drawn into a pitched battle. The Wei general had studied Zhuge Liang's methods over years of campaigns, and understood that caution was the only sure defense. If Sima Yi committed to a reckless assault, Shu's disciplined formations might yet prevail. And so the two armies settled into a stalemate, each waiting for the other to make the first irreversible move. From the walls of the Shu encampment, soldiers could see the distant watchfires of Wei's positions flickering in the dusk. It was a reminder that the enemy was patient and well supplied, and that every day spent in the field brought the Shu army closer to the point of no return. Still, Zhuge Liang did not waver. He sent envoys to try to open negotiations with local tribes who might be persuaded to disrupt Wei's supply lines. He ordered probing attacks along the river, hoping to force Sima Yi to commit troops and open a gap. He devised elaborate deceptions, decoy camps, false signals, sudden maneuvers to keep the enemy guessing. For weeks, these efforts created an illusion of activity, but they yielded no decisive opportunity. And all the while his illness worsened. Each morning he rose before dawn to inspect the positions. Each evening he met with his staff to discuss the day's intelligence. By the small hours of the night he would be alone, seated at a table littered with the scrolls, his breath shallow and labored. He kept a record of everything: supply tallies, casualty lists, plans for future operations, written in his own hand, as if by recording each detail he could hold his enterprise together a little longer. It is hard to say whether he still believed victory was possible. Perhaps in the unguarded moments when no one was watching, he understood that the campaign was no longer a strategy of conquest, but an assertion of purpose. To be there to remain on that plain in the face of the inevitable was itself a statement that Shu would not vanish quietly, that legitimacy mattered, even when it could no longer be defended by arms. Among his staff there were those who began to despair. They looked at the dwindling supplies and the lengthening casualty lists, and saw only the outline of defeat. But no one dared to suggest withdrawal while the chancellor still lived. His presence held the army together as surely as any fortification. In the final weeks he wrote a memorial to Liu Shan, a last testament of his convictions. He urged the emperor to rely on capable ministers after his death, to reward merit and restrain corruption, to remember that even a small kingdom could endure if it remained just. And in that document, there is no trace of bitterness. He does not curse fate for denying him victory. He does not accuse others of betrayal. Instead, he writes with the quiet clarity of a man who had given everything he had to a cause larger than himself. As the season turned from late summer to autumn, the rain returned to the plains. The roads became rivers of mud. The fires burned lower each night, and though no final battle was ever fought, the campaign's end was approaching all the same. From the first day he set foot on Wujiang Plains, Zhuge Liang must have known that this was his last throw of the dice. It was not a gamble for territory or even survival, but for meaning itself. In his heart, perhaps, he believed that to try and fail was better than to surrender the dream to silence. And so he remained while the wind sighed through the grass, and the shadows lengthened, awaiting the moment when he would be called home. Autumn on the Wujiang Plains had always been unpredictable. Some years the rains held off until the harvest was gathered. Other times storms swept down without warning, turning the roads into channels of mud and soaking the tents so thoroughly that nothing could be kept dry. In the autumn of 234, the weather seemed determined to remind Zhuge Liang and everyone around him that no amount of preparation could control fate. At first, the signs were subtle. A morning fog that lingered too long. A coolness in the breeze that hinted at early frost. Then in the space of a few days, the rains came in earnest. They fell in cold sheets that rattled the canvas roofs and churned the ground into a sucking mire. Wagons that had survived months of careful hauling sank axle deep and could not be moved. Mules slipped and broke legs on the slick inclines. Men who had endured years of hardship felt their strength falter under the steady, unrelenting drizzle. Everywhere you looked, the traces of human effort were dissolving into the mud. In the watchtowers along the perimeter, sentries stared into the gray curtain that obscured the enemy's camps. It was impossible to tell what Sima Yi was doing, but in some ways it no longer mattered. The true adversary had become the season itself. For Zhuge Liang, this was not a surprise. He had spent too many years fighting in these borderlands to trust the sky's apparent serenity. That was why he had stockpiled supplies near the front, why he had built drainage ditches and reinforced embankments. And yet, for all his foresight, the rain came faster than the laborers could dig. When night fell, the campfires sputtered and died under the downpour. Officers gathered in the command tent, unrolling damp maps on the lacquered table. By the flicker of lantern light, they argued over the same grim options: ration supplies, further abandon some positions to consolidate manpower, or risk an assault that could not be supported if the roads remained impassable. Through it all, the Chancellor sat silent, listening. His face, already wan from illness, had grown almost translucent in the lantern's glow. His hands trembled when he raised his cup of hot water, though he steadied them quickly when he realized others were watching. If he felt the despair that crept through the ranks, he did not allow it to show. Instead, he spoke in the same measured voice he had used since the first day of the campaign. He reminded his staff that the enemy faced the same rains, the same hardship, the same hunger. That victory was not always a matter of force, but of endurance. In that moment, some of them believed him again. They dispersed into the wet darkness, carrying his quiet resolve with them. But when the tent was empty, Zhuge Liang was left alone with the knowledge that his words could not alter the simple arithmetic of depletion. Each day the rain fell, their grain stores shrank. Each night the sick lists grew longer. Each dawn the men rose a little slower, their eyes fixed on the horizon with a weariness that had nothing to do with sleep. There is an old saying, "Heaven has no favorites." In the long record of that autumn, you can see how true it is. The reports preserved in later chronicles are heartbreakingly mundane. 20 carts lost to flooding in the western depot. Rations reduced by 1/3 to preserve stores. 9 mules euthanized after injuries. 4 soldiers perished of fever. Nothing in these entries hints at the nobility of the cause or the grandeur of the dream. They are simply the final toll of a war that had already claimed too much. Still, Zhuge Liang continued to act as though success was possible. He dispatched messengers to Chengdu with requests for additional supplies, knowing that little could be sent before winter closed the mountain passes. He ordered repairs to the embankments even as the water rose faster than men could drain it away. He reviewed contingency plans for an orderly withdrawal, though he did not authorize them. Above all, he kept up appearances. Every morning he emerged from his tent to inspect the lines leaning on a staff he had once carried only for ceremony. He paused to speak with soldiers, to praise them for their discipline, to remind them that they bore the honor of Shu Han on their shoulders. And when he returned to the command tent, he sat alone for long stretches, listening to the rain tapping on the roof like a clock, counting down the last moments of his life. From the Wei encampment, Sima Yi watched with growing certainty that his caution had been rewarded. Though he would later be criticized for failing to attack, he had achieved exactly what he intended. He had forced Zhuge Liang to exhaust himself in a campaign the weather would finish. Some of Sima Yi's officers urged him to strike, arguing that a decisive blow could end Shua's threat forever. But Sima Yi, ever patient, refused. He understood that sometimes the greatest victory requires no sword, drawn only the wisdom to let your enemy's strength decay without help. And so, while the Shu camps sank deeper into despair, the Wei army remained behind their fortifications, watching and waiting. In Chengdu, news came slowly. The reports were stripped of detail, couched in language designed to reassure the court. But even the most carefully chosen words could not hide the reality that the fifth expedition had become a siege against the elements. Liu Shan read the messages with a hollow ache in his chest. He knew his chancellor was dying, though no one would say it aloud. He issued decrees praising Zhuge Liang's steadfastness and ordering more resources to be prepared. But everyone understood that it was too late. When the rain finally slackened in late autumn, it was not a reprieve, but an epilogue. The roads were ruined, the grain nearly gone. The army was too weakened to press any advantage. In the end, there was no climactic battle, no last heroic charge. There was only the long, slow realization that the campaign had reached its end without ever truly beginning. And in that quiet, as the winds of winter began to rise, Zhuge Liang looked across the sodden plains and knew that his final plan had fulfilled its true purpose, not to conquer, but to prove that Shu Han's spirit had not yet surrendered. If heaven had no favorites, then at least he had remained faithful to the last. And perhaps in some small way that faith was victory enough. In the long chronicle of Zhuge Liang's life, there are moments that history records in bright, decisive strokes, victories at Hanzhong reforms in Chengdu, the early campaigns that seemed to promise so much. But if you search for the heart of his story, you will not find it in the fanfare of triumph or the ceremonies of state. You will find it here in the nights he spent in the rain-soaked camp on Wujiang Plains, when the world had grown small and quiet, and the only audience for his labors was the flickering lantern and the cold wind that slipped through the seams of the tent. The men called it Kai-son, though the official records referred to it as Wujiang. To them it was simply the place where they waited for orders for reinforcements, for an end to the rain. And for Zhuge Liang, it was the place where he waited for the end of his own strength. Those who served close to the chancellor wrote later that he rarely slept, even when the camp had settled into uneasy silence with the watchfires burning low and the soldiers huddled in their damp blankets. The candle in his tent still glowed. Inside, he sat at his desk, the scrolls spread before him in careful rows. His brush moved steadily over each document, supply tallies, duty rosters, letters to the court contingency orders, in case the army was forced to withdraw without him. When the coughing grew too fierce to hide, he covered his mouth with a sleeve and waited for the fit to pass. Then he bent over the papers again. Sometimes the scribes heard him murmuring to himself soft calculations, reminders, prayers, and sometimes when he thought no one was listening, he simply sat with his hand resting on the blank page, as though the words he needed had finally deserted him. Out beyond the perimeter, the plain stretched into darkness, broken only by the watchfires of Sima Yi's encampments. No banners moved in the night wind. No horns sounded. It was as if the entire land had agreed to wait in silence for the last act to unfold. In those nights, the soldiers felt time differently. Some had served the Chancellor since the first expedition. They had followed him over mountains and rivers, through victories and retreats, until their memories blurred together in a single long march. To them, this last campaign was not so much a battle as a vigil. They did not speak of triumph anymore. They spoke of duty, of holding the line, of not shaming the name of Shu. And always at the center of their thoughts was the figure in the tent, the man who had led them so far, who still rose before dawn to inspect the sentries, who still spoke to each of them as though their courage was the most precious resource he had left. The cooks learned to prepare thin porridge with the last of the stores. The quartermasters distributed rations in silence. The scribes kept their records, though the ink smeared in the damp air. No one asked how much longer it could go on. The Chancellor himself seemed determined to act, as though nothing had changed. Each morning he dressed in his plain robe and put on the headscarf that had become as much a part of his legend as any of his deeds. He stepped out into the cold dawn and nodded to the guards, who straightened at the sight of him. He moved slowly now, leaning on a staff, but his gaze was clear. When he spoke, it was with the same calm certainty that had carried them through a decade of campaigns. Hold your posts. See to your men. Do not forget who we are. Those words were not grand, but in them the soldiers heard everything they needed. At night, when the wind rose and the rain began again, some of them would look toward the Chancellor's tent, watching the candle that never seemed to go out. It was a comfort proof that he was still there, that the dream had not yet died. And yet behind the canvas walls, Zhuge Liang felt his strength ebbing in ways he could no longer deny. He had always been a man of discipline, able to endure fatigue that would have broken others. But in those final weeks, the effort to stand and walk left him trembling. His cough worsened until each breath came shallow and ragged. Still, he refused to be confined to his bed. When his attendants begged him to rest, he shook his head. "The army stands because I stand," he said. "When I can no longer rise, you will know it is time." One night, as the rain hammered the tent roof like 1,000 drumming fingers, he called for his secretary. In a voice barely stronger than a whisper, he dictated a final memorial to Liu Shan. It was not long, barely a few hundred characters, but every word was chosen with the care he had given all his labors. In it, he explained the condition of the army and the measures he had taken to preserve order. He asked the emperor to trust incapable ministers after his death. He urged mercy toward those who had served faithfully, even if they had disagreed with him. At the end, he wrote simply, "I have done all I could." When the secretary finished copying the text, Zhuge Liang pressed his seal to it with hands that trembled so badly the wax cracked. Then he closed his eyes and rested his head against the chair. Outside, the rain fell without pause. In the darkness, the sentries walked their patrols. The sick lay awake, listening to the storm. Somewhere a mule brayed in pain, then fell silent. It was a night like so many before it, wet, cold, interminable. But in the small circle of lantern light inside the tent, something was ending. Though he would rise again in the mornings that followed, though he would continue to issue orders and speak words of encouragement, those who saw him knew that the final measure of his strength had been spent in that vigil. From that point on, it was only his will that kept him among them. And so the nights continued, each one longer than the last, each one carrying them closer to the moment when the candle in the Chancellor's tent would be extinguished forever. By the final weeks on Wuzhang Plains, Zhuge Liang's illness was no longer something he could hide, no matter how determined his spirit remained. At dawn, when he stepped out to inspect the lines, soldiers could see how his face had thinned, how the hollows beneath his cheekbones had deepened. His once sure stride had become a measured, halting walk. Each movement required an effort that left him breathless. Yet still he refused to yield to the sickness. He took no more than a few mouthfuls of thin gruel each day. Even that he sometimes could not keep down. The physicians begged him to rest, to surrender the burden of command, but he only smiled faintly and shook his head. "If I am not here," he said, "then who will hold the line?" The scribes who served him later described the air of those days as hushed and solemn. Everyone understood that their leader was dying, but no one dared to speak it aloud. To admit it was to accept the end of the campaign, and perhaps the end of the dream itself. His tent became the true heart of the camp. All decisions, no matter how small, still passed through his hands. Even when fever left him unable to speak, he would gesture for his secretaries to bring the reports. Lying propped against pillows, he traced the rows of characters with a trembling finger, nodding or shaking his head in response. Outside, the rains eased at last, but the damage had been done. The roads were still impassable in many places, and the remaining supplies were dwindling by the hour. Some officers began to argue for withdrawal in private. They knew that without Zhuge Liang's presence to steady the men, morale would collapse. Yet no one dared to suggest it to his face. At night, the sentries still saw the dim glow of his lantern. Even as his strength faded, he refused to let the light go dark. He slept little, waking, often in the small hours, to dictate instructions. Once in a moment of clarity, he summoned Jiang Wei and spoke in a voice so thin, it was like a draft slipping under a door. "After I am gone, remember this, the cause is not ended. Because one man falls. As long as you keep faith, Shu will not truly be defeated." Jiang Wei knelt beside his bedhead, bowed. In that moment, he felt not only the grief of a disciple watching his master fade, but the enormity of the burden being placed upon him. Others came to pay respects in the days that followed. Some were old comrades who had marched with him for years. Some were young captains who had never known another commander. To each, Zhuge Liang gave the same measured encouragement, though his voice grew fainter with every hour. Outside, the camp had settled into an eerie stillness. Soldiers moved with the quiet of men who knew that any noise might disturb the last fragile thread holding their leader to this world. One evening, as dusk settled over the plains, the Chancellor asked to be carried to the entrance of his tent. Wrapped in a cloak against the chill, he looked out across the encampment rows of battered tents, the watchfires guttering in the wind, the silhouettes of men standing silent in the gloom. Perhaps he was remembering all the roads that had led them here, the years of planning the marches over mountain passes, the countless nights spent in vigil over maps and ledgers. Or perhaps he was simply saying farewell. When his attendants tried to lift him back inside, he raised a thin hand to stop them. For a moment he closed his eyes, breathing the cold air. Then he opened them again and looked north toward the unseen heartland of Wei. He did not speak. He did not need to. Everyone understood. After a long moment, he let his hand fall, and they bore him gently back to his bed. From that night onward, he did not rise again. The final hours were a blur of fever and shallow breathing. His secretaries knelt beside him, recording his last words. His physicians did what little they could, though all knew their efforts were in vain. Even as delirium overtook him, he remained fixed on his duty. He murmured the names of officers, the numbers of supply carts, the positions of sentries, as if by sheer force of will he could hold the army together a little longer. At last, near dawn, he fell silent. The candle at his bedside flickered low. His hand resting on the coverlet grew still. And so, as the first pale light of morning touched the wet earth of Wuzhang Plains, Zhuge Liang, the sleeping dragon, left the world he had labored so long to preserve. There were no trumpets, no final proclamations, only a hush so complete that even the wind seemed to pause in respect. In that quiet, a chapter of history closed, and the dream he had carried heavier than any burden passed into the hands of those who remained. When dawn broke over Wuzhang Plains, the soldiers did not yet know that their chancellor had breathed his last. In the stillness before the drums of morning assembly, the camp seemed unchanged, tense, glistening with dew watchfires smoldering to embers, crows calling from the riverbank. Only within the command tent did a hush settle so deep it felt like a veil. Those who had kept vigil through the night bowed their heads. Some wept quietly, though they had sworn to remain composed. Others simply stared at the pale figure on the cot, unwilling to believe that the man who had carried them through so many trials was finally gone. Zhuge Liang's final hours had been a testament to the discipline that had defined his life. Even when he could no longer rise or speak clearly, he remained intent on recording his last instructions. In those last moments of lucidity, he called for Jiang Wei Yang Yi and the other senior officers. With a voice no stronger than a whisper, he dictated his final wishes. He asked that the army maintain strict order, that no soldier take advantage of the confusion to desert or plunder. He charged his generals to withdraw in good order rather than squander lives in a futile battle. Above all, he entreated them to remember that the purpose of the struggle was never mere conquest. It is the duty of the loyal to sustain the state. He said, his breath ragged. So long as you hold faith, Shu is not lost. When he had finished, he gestured for his writing brush. It took both hands to steady it. With painstaking effort, he marked the final characters of his testament, his seal pressed into the wax by an attendant, as he no longer had the strength. Those who witnessed this moment later said that the act itself seemed to hold him in the world for a few moments longer. As if by fulfilling his duty to the last stroke of the brush, he could pass beyond without regret. Once the final document was complete, he closed his eyes and did not speak again. After his passing, Jiang Wei and Yang Yi gathered the officers in a private council. No proclamations were made at once. The first priority was to secure the camp. They knew that if the news spread too quickly, panic could take root. Some soldiers might attempt to flee. Others might despair and refuse orders. And across the river, Sima Yi's scouts were surely watching for any sign that the great strategist was gone. To conceal Zhuge Liang's death, they carried out one of the most remarkable deceptions of the age. A wooden effigy was hastily crafted, draped on the chancellor's robes placed in his carriage. At dawn, the familiar standard with his insignia was raised over the command tent as it had been every morning. From a distance, the figure seated in the carriage seemed to move, bowing its head in the same dignified gesture the soldiers had come to expect. The effect was eerie. Some men swore they felt their chancellor's presence as strongly as ever. Others shivered to see his likeness pass, among them silent as a ghost. For several days this illusion held. Orders continued to be issued in his name. Patrols were doubled to maintain discipline. Only the most trusted officers knew the truth. In the quiet hours between duties, they came one by one to the tent where Zhuge Liang's body lay in state. Each offered a final bow. Some pressed their foreheads to the threshold, overcome with grief. Outside the camp, settled into the same routines as before, cooking fires, weapons drills, quiet conversations in the intervals between rain. But in every heart, there was the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. Among the chancellor's last wishes was that no elaborate rites be held on the battlefield. He asked instead for simplicity, a plain coffin, no lavish offerings, no public mourning that would weaken the army's resolve. "Let the rites wait until we are home," he had said. "Here we must still stand." This was his final lesson, that duty did not end with death. At last, when preparations were complete, Yang Yi convened the generals once more. In a voice hoarse with fatigue, he read aloud the final testament. Zhuge Liang named Jiang Wan and Fei Yi as the men to whom civil affairs should be entrusted. He urged them to support the young emperor with candor and loyalty. He named Jiang Wei as the successor to his military command. Though still young, Jiang Wei had shown the same relentless commitment that had defined his master's life. To each he gave a parting admonition, never bitter, always measured. When the reading ended, there was a silence as heavy as the rain that had so often beaten on the tents. No one spoke. Then one by one the officers knelt, pressing their foreheads to the ground. They had followed the chancellor through every hardship. Now they would see his remains safely home. At dawn the next day, the withdrawal began. The wooden effigy remained in the carriage, its presence a final deception to deter pursuit. Only when the Shu army was safely beyond the mountain passes did the officers order the figure removed. When Sima Yi learned the truth that the man he had watched so warily was already dead, he is said to have sighed. "I knew he was formidable," he murmured, "but I did not know that even in death he would outwit me." And so Zhuge Liang's last journey began. Not in triumph, but in fidelity, escorted by men who had given him their loyalty to the end. As the columns wound south through the passes, the mists closed behind them, erasing the tracks, as if to mark that an era had ended. When the Shu army began its long retreat from Wuzhang Plains, there was no triumph in their departure, only the silent acknowledgement that a chapter of history had closed. They moved slowly, each regiment keeping tight formation, as the carts bearing Zhuge Liang's remains creaked streaked along the mountain roads. The soldiers did not sing, they did not cheer. Even the mules seemed subdued, as though the sorrow of so many men had settled into their bones. To look at the columns from afar was to see an army held together by habit more than hope. Behind them the plains lay empty. The trenches and palisades that had once bristled with purpose were left to the wind and the rain, and in every mind was the same thought: what happens to us now? In the years of the northern expeditions, Zhuge Liang had been more than a general. He was the reason so many men had believed they could endure one more campaign, one more march, one more season away from home. Now with his death, that conviction began to crumble. As the army wound south along the passes, discipline held barely. Jiang Wei, newly entrusted with military command, rode tirelessly along the ranks, reminding soldiers that the chancellor had left them not only orders, but faith in their courage. Yet he was young. His authority, though legitimate, did not carry the same gravity. Many veterans looked at him and saw a talented officer, but not yet the figure around whom the kingdom could rally. The burden of leadership settled on his shoulders like a weight no one could help him carry. In the nights when the columns camped among the pine forests, the men spoke in hushed voices of what awaited them in Chengdu. Some feared the court would fracture without the chancellor's discipline. Others feared that Sima Yi, emboldened by Zhuge Liang's death, would march south in pursuit. In truth, Sima Yi did consider striking the retreating army, but he hesitated. According to later chronicles, he walked the abandoned Shu fortifications for hours, examining the empty trenches and rain-damp palisades. At last, he is said to have smiled and shaken his head. "He is gone," he told his officers. But even in death, he leaves no gap in his defenses. It was true. The withdrawal had been planned as meticulously as every other operation Zhuge Liang had overseen. Supply caches had been laid in advance. Contingency routes were mapped. Signals were prepared to coordinate the retreat without confusion. The effect was eerie, vanishing, as precise as the campaigns had been. And so, Sima Yi chose caution over ambition. He ordered his army to hold position rather than pursue into the mountains, reasoning that the loss of Zhuge Liang was itself a victory greater than any battlefield could offer. In Chengdu, word of the chancellor's death arrived in carefully phrased dispatches. The first announcements spoke of illness. Only later did the truth emerge he had passed away on the plains far from home, after completing every duty he believed he owed to the dynasty. The court was thrown into mourning. Liu Shan wept openly before his ministers. Those who had opposed Zhuge Liang's endless campaigns found no satisfaction in his passing. For all their disagreements, they had depended on his presence to hold the kingdom together. Without him, Shu felt suddenly smaller, just a narrow basin of farms and towns hemmed in by mountains and overshadowed by the vast power of Wei. In the weeks that followed, the army's return became a somber procession. As the columns reached the outskirts of Chengdu, people gathered along the roads to watch them pass. No one jeered, no one called out. They simply stood in silence, hats removed, as the carts bearing their chancellor's coffin rolled by. Some of the older men pressed their palms together in a gesture of respect. Mothers lifted children onto their hips so they would remember the moment when the man who had been called Wolong, the sleeping dragon, came home for the last time. The funeral rites were simple as he had requested. No elaborate shrines were built. No great expense was spent on ceremony. His coffin was interred on Dingjun Mountain near the old battlefields where he had first led Shu's armies. There, in a small tomb overlooking the valley, he was laid to rest among the hills that had so often echoed with the clash of ambition and the quiet determination of a man who believed that virtue, not conquest, was the truest legacy. In the months after his passing, the cohesion he'd enforced began to slip. Jiang Wan and Fei Yi took up the administration of the state, working to preserve Zhuge Liang's policies. Jiang Wei assumed command of the military, resolved to continue the northern expeditions despite the exhaustion of the kingdom. But there was no disguising the fact that an era had ended. The soldiers who had followed Zhuge Liang into the north did not forget his discipline or his unwavering purpose. Yet even their respect could not fill the void his absence created. Factions re-emerged in the court. Old disputes resurfaced. And beyond the mountains, the generals of Wei watched, knowing that time itself was now their greatest ally. In later chronicles, historians would argue over whether Zhuge Liang's campaigns had been acts of wisdom or futility. Some claimed that he had squandered Shu's limited resources on a dream that could never be realized. Others wrote that had he lived a few years longer, he might have achieved the breakthrough he had so long pursued. But for the men who had served him, who had watched him labor in the cold dawn and the rain, who had heard his voice in the darkness, reminding them to hold their honor, there was never any question of why he had done it. He had done it because he believed that even in defeat, there was a dignity that no empire could erase. And when they spoke of him in the years that followed, they did not speak first of the battles he had won or lost. They spoke of the nights he had spent among them, the lantern always burning the brush, moving steadily across the page as if he alone could keep the darkness at bay. When the last echoes of Zhuge Liang's campaigns faded, those who studied them began to see with clearer eyes why his final plan could never have succeeded. It was not because he lacked vision or courage or skill. He possessed all those in measure few men have ever matched. But even the most brilliant mind cannot conjure possibilities out of nothing. The first unchangeable limit was Shu itself. A kingdom of mountains and valleys rich in spirit, but poor in resources, Shu had always been the smallest of the three kingdoms. Its population was too few to sustain an army large enough to break Wei's defenses outright. Each expedition was paid for in harvests that could not be replaced and lives that could not be replenished. No matter how precise the chancellor's planning, there was never enough, never quite enough grain, enough men, enough time. The second limit was geography. To reach the plains of Wei, his armies had to cross treacherous mountain passes. Every mile of advance stretched the supply lines thinner. Every autumn, rain threatened to wash their lifelines away. And the enemy knew this. Sima Yi was no reckless commander. He refused to be baited into battles on Zhuge Liang's terms. He watched, waited, and trusted that time and hunger would do his work for him. Again and again this strategy proved its worth. The third limit was faith itself. Zhuge Liang believed with all his being that Shu's claim to legitimacy was worth any sacrifice. To abandon the northern expeditions would be to confess that the dream of restoring Han unity was nothing more than a story to comfort children. He would not betray that faith. but in holding to it so fiercely he asked of his people a burden greater than they could long endure. By the final campaign, the soldiers no longer marched with hope in their hearts. They marched because duty compelled them, and duty alone without some promise of victory is a fragile foundation. Perhaps in his last quiet hours he understood this truth, that some causes are noble precisely because they are doomed. He must have known that the plan was no longer about winning in any ordinary sense. It was about refusing to let the candle of legitimacy go out. To show the world and themselves that Shu still had the strength to stand, even if standing was all it could do. In the end, that was the true meaning of his last expedition. Not a bid for conquest, but a final declaration of purpose. And though the fields of Wujiang grew silent after his passing, the story did not end there. His legacy remained in the memory of those who had walked beside him, in the records carefully copied and preserved, in the legend of the man who labored without rest, who believed that faith was more enduring than any fortress, and in the quiet knowledge that sometimes the worth of an endeavor is not measured by success, but by the courage it takes to try. Long after the banners of Shu were furled and the mountains grew quiet again, the memory of Zhuge Liang lingered like the last embers of a long-burning fire. He had not lived to see the unification he dreamed of. He had not broken Wei's power or restored the Han to its old splendor. But in the eyes of those who came after, his legacy was never measured in territory. It was measured in character. The chronicles speak of his tireless labor, how he rose before dawn, how he worked deep into the night by lamplight, how he never asked of his men what he would not do himself. They tell of his refusal to enrich himself, though he held authority beyond any minister. When he died, his family's possessions could be listed on a single page: a few books, plain clothing, and a modest home. His enemies respected him no less than his allies. Sima Yi, who had opposed him for years, is said to have mourned his passing. He was the pillar of Shu, he remarked. With him gone, the realm will fall. And indeed, in the years after Zhuge Liang's death, Shu began its slow decline. Without his discipline, the court grew fractious. Without his planning, the northern expeditions faltered into defeat. Yet even in failure, his example endured. Jiang Wei, his protégé, carried on the campaigns as an homage to his master's vision, though the kingdom no longer had the strength to support them. For generations, scholars would debate whether this was wisdom or folly. Some called Zhuge Liang stubborn, too devoted to an ideal that could never be achieved. Others called him the last true servant of the Han, a man who placed duty above all. But among the common people, the stories were simpler. They told of the chancellor who never wasted a coin, who ate the same rations as the soldiers who walked the camps in the rain, to see that every man had a blanket. They spoke of the lantern in his tent, still burning long after others had gone dark. And they said that when he died, something of the old virtue died with him. In that way, his legacy became larger than any campaign or policy. It became a measure of what it means to serve a cause completely without thought of reward. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the fields lay under moonlight, and the mountains rose like dark sentinels, some still remembered the man who labored to keep faith alive long after others had given up. Even now, centuries later, his story endures, not only as a tale of strategy and ambition, but as a reminder that there is dignity in striving for what may never be won, and that sometimes the truest triumph is simply to endure. And so in this quiet hour, as you lie in the soft darkness, with your eyes growing heavy, remember that even the most tireless souls must one day rest. The candle in Zhuge Liang's tent has long since gone out, leaving only a memory of its steady glow and the hush of the mountains that watched over him. Let yourself imagine the last embers settling into ash, the damp fields turning silver beneath the first touch of dawn, and the distant hills dissolving slowly into the morning mist. There is nothing here that asks you to hurry. No need to search for answers or measure victories. Only the thought that all things, dreams, burdens, hopes, find their ending in time, and that this too is part of their quiet purpose. As you feel your breath deepen and the world drift a little farther away, know that you are safe here, held in a story that asks nothing of you but to rest. May this stillness remain with you like a gentle whisper, reminding you that you have done enough, and it is perfectly all right to close your eyes now. Good night.